Mechanic thought he was just helping a woman in need, but the truth changed his life forever. Have you ever met a stranger who, somehow, completely changed your life? Imagine a normal day, driving through a small town, expecting nothing more than familiar roads and faded signs, until suddenly a minor incident changes everything. Your car breaks down in the middle of nowhere, the rain begins to pour, and you're forced to pull into an unfamiliar garage. But what if the mechanic who fixes your car doesn't just help you get back on the road? He opens a door to an entirely new journey, one you never saw coming. This isn't just a story about a broken down car and a chance encounter. It's a story about second chances, healing, and how one unexpected moment can change everything forever. Have you ever had a random encounter that made you rethink your entire life? Share your story in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. And if you enjoy stories about love, transformation, and the small miracles of life, hit subscribe right now. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Now picture a quiet road along Whispering Pines Road, a humble garage named Martinez Auto Repair, and a lonely man who expected nothing more from his day than just another job until she walked in. Cedarvale, a quiet little town nestled at the edge of dense forests, where days passed as slowly and steadily as the roads covered in golden leaves every autumn. But for Christopher Martinez, time had stopped many years ago. Inside Martinez Auto Repair, sparks from the welding torch flashed, reflecting in his thoughtful eyes. The rhythmic clanging of metal echoed softly through the quiet space, a familiar rhythm Christopher had relied on to fill the silence left behind after his wife's death. His entire world now revolved around engines, grease, and old cars waiting to be fixed, a world he could control. No surprises, no changes. But fate cared little for old habits. One afternoon, as the sun began sinking behind the trees, a luxury car pulled slowly into the parking lot, the dust coating its glossy paint, hinting it had traveled a long journey. A woman stepped out. No rush, no panic, only a calm composure and something deeper reflected in her eyes, a weariness she couldn't hide. Scarlett Victoria. Christopher didn't know who she was, but in that brief moment when their eyes met, something stirred within him, an unfamiliar feeling, as though he'd met her before, somewhere else, in another lifetime. He leaned down to check the engine, his hands accustomed to fixing everything. But there were some things you couldn't repair by tightening bolts or replacing parts. Do you think there are things that can never go back to the way they were? Scarlett asked softly, her voice quiet, as if the question wasn't really meant for him, but for herself. Christopher looked up, his gaze lingering on her face a little longer than usual. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure how to answer. The crunch of tires on gravel, then suddenly, silence. Scarlett Victoria gripped the steering wheel tightly, staring at the dashboard as if it could offer some other answer, besides this unsettling quiet. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't the first time she'd faced car trouble, but somehow this time felt different. Opening the car door, the cold wind slapped against her face as she stepped out, her high heels sinking slightly into the wet gravel by the roadside. Around her were only the towering trees of Whispering Pines Road, silent and watchful. No other cars, no signs of life. Scarlett pulled out her phone, no signal. She laughed softly, a bitter chuckle from someone accustomed to controlling every detail, only to be reminded that life sometimes doesn't care about your plans. Then in the distance, the low rumble of an engine broke the silence. An old pickup truck rounded the corner, headlights cutting through the mist. Scarlett instinctively stepped back as it pulled up beside her, the window slowly rolling down. "Looks like you're having trouble." The voice was calm, deep. The man behind the wheel had a weathered look, shirt sleeves rolled up, hands stained with grease. But his eyes were not those of a stranger. There was something in them Scarlett couldn't quite name. A knowing, an understanding she hadn't expected. Christopher Martinez. "The car died," she said, keeping her voice steady, "and my phone has no signal." He nodded as if this story were all too familiar. "I can take a look." Scarlett hesitated. Trusting strangers wasn't something she usually did, but given the situation, it seemed she didn't have much of a choice. She nodded, Christopher stepped out, popping the hood of her expensive convertible. As he examined the engine, Scarlett watched him. A man from a completely different world, yet somehow she found herself unable to look away. She didn't know what would happen next, but a strange feeling stirred inside her, as if this meeting was more than just a coincidence. "It's nothing serious," Christopher said, tightening one last bolt before straightening up, hands smeared with grease, eyes calm as ever. "Just needed a minor adjustment." Scarlett watched him carefully. There was something about the way he worked, focused, meticulous, as if every car had its own soul that he was meant to heal. He wasn't putting on a show or taking advantage of the situation. He was simply doing what needed to be done. "So how much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching into her handbag, where cash could easily solve everything. Christopher shook his head, wiping his hands on an old rag, voice steady. "It's nothing, just a minor adjustment." Scarlett hesitated. Nobody had ever said that to her before. She was used to transactions. You give something, you get something in return. Everything in her world came with a price tag. Yet here on this quiet road was a man who had spent his time helping her without expecting anything back. "Are you sure?" she asked again, skepticism in her voice. Christopher merely shrugged. "Some things don't need to be calculated." Scarlett gave a soft laugh. A simple statement, but it shook something deep within her. She looked at Christopher more closely. He had no idea who she was. He didn't know she was Scarlett Victoria, the businesswoman featured on magazine covers, capable of signing multi-million-dollar deals in a single afternoon. What should she say? That she could probably buy this entire town if she wanted? That she wasn't used to receiving kindness without strings attached? But instead, she simply said, "Then can I thank you with dinner?" Christopher paused, looking at her thoughtfully for a moment, as though weighing something in his mind. She prepared herself for rejection, but instead he nodded. "All right, just don't pick anywhere too fancy." Scarlett laughed, feeling as if something had just shifted, a chance meeting perhaps, but maybe not so random after all. Christopher stared at the menu, twisting a corner nervously between his fingers. Cedar Vale's Silver Lake Diner was no stranger to him, a cozy little place with worn wooden tables, vintage photographs of the town decorating the walls, and the familiar strong aroma of coffee hanging gently in the air. Yet somehow, tonight felt entirely different. Sitting across from him was Scarlett Victoria, a woman who seemed to belong to another world entirely. She looked oddly at ease, even amid the checkered tablecloths and rustic decor, a stark contrast to the luxury and sophistication that radiated from her. He had planned on declining her invitation. In fact, every instinct he had told him to refuse. But when Scarlett stood there, determination clear in her eyes, hands slightly trembling yet resolute, he found himself unable to say no. Because for once, this wasn't about obligation or payment. It was simply someone genuinely wanting to do something kind. "Do you come here often?" Scarlett asked, gently placing her coffee cup down. Christopher shrugged. "Not too often, but the apple pie's pretty good." Scarlett smiled, eyes sparkling playfully. "Well then, if it's not as good as you say, you owe me an apology." Christopher laughed, a genuine laugh. He couldn't remember the last time he laughed so freely. Their conversation flowed naturally, effortless, like the water quietly drifting by outside. But as the evening slowly wound down, Scarlett suddenly fell silent, her gaze drifting toward the lake, where the lights danced softly upon the calm surface. "Do you ever feel," she began slowly, carefully choosing each word, "like there are certain things in life that can never go back to how they once were?" Christopher felt something tighten in his chest, a familiar ache returning. He knew exactly what she meant, yet instead of answering directly, he simply said, "Maybe tonight is one of those moments." Scarlett turned to look at him, and for a fleeting moment, nothing else existed except the quiet intensity of their shared gaze. Scarlett Victoria gently traced her finger around the rim of her coffee cup, her gaze drifting out the window of Silver Lake Diner. Outside, streetlights softly illuminated quiet streets, where small shops had closed early. An elderly couple walked slowly, hand in hand beneath the trees, and silence embraced everything in the warm glow of twilight. Christopher Martinez sat across from her, quietly observing her, as if trying to decipher what she was thinking. "Have you lived here your entire life?" Scarlett asked, breaking the silence. Christopher nodded slightly. "Mostly. There was a time I thought about leaving, but in the end I stayed." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Christopher hesitated a moment. "I don't know. Maybe it just never felt right to leave." Scarlett understood more deeply than she wanted to admit. Her own life had always been meetings, hurried flights, and expensive yet lonely hotel dinners. Success didn't necessarily mean happiness, and perhaps for the first time, she was beginning to accept that. "You've lived here all your life, yet you seem so calm," she finally said, breaking the silence once again. Christopher smiled faintly. "Sometimes peace is enough." Scarlett leaned back, her fingers tapping lightly against the table. "I envy that." At that moment, something caught her attention. An elderly woman at the next table stood up, struggling slightly with her coat. Before Scarlett could react, Christopher quietly rose, helped her into her jacket, and received a gentle pat on his arm in return. "Thank you, young man," the woman whispered warmly. Christopher nodded, returning to his seat as though it were nothing unusual. Scarlett watched him carefully, a realization slowly dawning on her. The way he acted, the small kindnesses he extended effortlessly. They weren't something everyone could do. She looked at Christopher for a long moment, and in that instant, her world seemed just a little less hurried, a little less complicated. Scarlett gently rotated the coffee cup in her hands, her gaze fixed on the small spoon resting on the saucer, though her mind drifted elsewhere, to another place entirely. Christopher watched her quietly, sensing there was more beneath the surface. He remained silent, giving her space to speak at her own pace. Somehow, sitting here in this small diner, under dim lights and surrounded by faded photographs, Scarlett felt safe enough to share something she'd never revealed to anyone else before. She took a slow breath. "A year ago, I was engaged." Christopher raised an eyebrow slightly but didn't interrupt. Scarlett smiled faintly, but there was no happiness in it. "We'd been together a long time. Everyone thought we were perfect, but I realized he didn't actually love me. He loved what I brought to the table. My name, my connections, the opportunities I could offer." Christopher set down his coffee cup thoughtfully. "So, you called it off." Scarlett nodded, eyes drifting toward the window again, where the soft glow from Silver Lake reflected gently off the still waters. "I realized he never really saw me. I was just part of his plan, and for so long, I convinced myself he'd eventually love the real me, if I tried hard enough." Christopher remained quiet. He understood the feeling more than she realized. After a moment, he finally asked softly, "How did you know it wasn't real?" Scarlett met his gaze again. "Because when I walked away, he didn't even try to stop me." She paused, a hint of sadness mixed with relief crossing her face. "So, here I am in a small diner with someone who doesn't know who I am, but was willing to fix my car without asking for anything in return." Christopher chuckled lightly. "You know, if I'd known you'd share a story like that, maybe I would have charged." Scarlett laughed gently, feeling lighter than she had in months. Maybe, just maybe, tonight marked the start of something new, something she hadn't even realized she was looking for. Scarlett gently rotated the coffee cup in her hands, eyes fixed absently on the small spoon, her mind drifting to a place she never thought she'd revisit again, a place she'd promised herself she'd leave behind. Christopher watched her quietly, sensing there was more beneath her silence. He didn't rush her, simply allowing his calm presence to create a space where, unexpectedly, she felt safe enough to share. She took a slow breath. "A year ago, I was engaged." Christopher raised an eyebrow slightly but remained quiet. Scarlett gave a faint laugh, though there was no joy behind it. "I thought I knew exactly what I wanted. He was everything I thought I needed, successful, charming, respected. On paper, it was perfect." Christopher set his coffee cup down thoughtfully. "But you ended it." Scarlett's gaze drifted toward the window, where the lights of Silver Lake shimmered softly on the water's calm surface. "I realized he didn't love me. He loved what I brought to the table. My name, my connections, my reputation." She laughed again softly without warmth. I thought he would love the real me eventually. Turns out trying to earn love by being useful isn't love at all. Christopher sat quietly, understanding her words more deeply than she could imagine. After a pause, he gently asked, how did you know it wasn't real? Scarlett met his gaze directly. Because when I left, he didn't try to stop me. He only tried to keep everything else. Everything I represented. She paused, a mixture of sadness and relief crossing her expression. And now here I am in a diner, sitting across from someone who doesn't know who I am, yet was willing to help me without expecting anything in return. Christopher chuckled softly. You know, if I'd known you were going to share a story like that, maybe I would have charged. Scarlett laughed lightly, genuinely. For the first time in a long while, she felt something lift inside her, a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. I'm not running away, Scarlett said softly. But the moment the words left her lips, she knew they weren't entirely true. Christopher didn't respond immediately. He just looked at her, the kind of look from someone who knew exactly what it meant to lose, to run and to hide. Outside, Silver Lake mirrored the diner's lights, shimmering softly across the water's surface. The cool night air crept quietly through the window, yet within this small space, a gentle warmth lingered. Scarlett rotated the coffee cup slowly in her hands. It's strange, isn't it? Two complete strangers can somehow understand each other in just one night. Christopher gave a slight nod. Because we both know what loss feels like. His words sliced through the air, simple but heavy with meaning. Scarlett met his gaze, truly meeting it for the first time without holding anything back. Her pain wasn't the same as his, but it had left scars of its own. She had always viewed love as transactional, a deal between two people who could benefit each other. But Christopher had loved in a way she never understood, sincerely, deeply, and without expecting anything in return. Have you ever felt trapped? Scarlett suddenly asked. Christopher tilted his head slightly, considering her words. How do you mean? She pressed her lips together, struggling to articulate the feeling. Like no matter where you go, who you meet, or how successful you become, there's always some part of you stuck in the same place. Outside, a breeze rustled the leaves gently, as though whispering secrets only they could understand. Christopher exhaled slowly. Every single day. Scarlett laughed quietly, not because what he said was funny, but because, for the first time, she didn't feel alone in that thought. There were no false reassurances exchanged between them. No empty phrases like, it'll get better, or time heals all wounds. Just two people existing together. Two people who thought they were alone, yet maybe finally discovering they weren't. Christopher looked into her eyes and said softly, maybe we're both searching for something. The question is, are we ready to find it? Christopher stood silently in the garage, the crumpled letter heavy in his hand, the words printed on it feeling heavier than any tool he'd ever held. Rent will increase by 30%, effective next month. Money he simply didn't have. Outside, Cedar Vale's sky deepened to burnt orange, the fading sunlight casting warm reflections across the dusty windows of Martinez Auto Repair. Yet today, instead of its usual peaceful beauty, the sunset carried a heaviness, like a quiet warning that something was about to change. Christopher rubbed his face, feeling grease smear onto his skin, but he didn't care. He'd fought to keep this garage open for years, and he couldn't let it disappear because of a cold, lifeless number on a piece of paper. From his corner of the shop, Ace let out a soft bark, as if sensing the tension lingering in the air. "What are we gonna do, buddy?" Christopher murmured, fully aware Ace couldn't answer. Part of him wanted to handle this alone, like he always had, but this time, things weren't so simple. Suddenly, the garage door swung open. Scarlett stood there. She wasn't dressed elegantly like the day they'd met, just a simple shirt, jeans, hair pulled loosely back. But somehow she still looked perfect in the sunset's golden glow. She looked at him, then at the letter in his hand. The silence between them wasn't a question, it was understanding. "What's going on?" she asked softly, her voice gentle yet piercing the tension. Christopher tightened his grip on the letter. Part of him wanted to lie, to pretend everything was fine. But when he looked into Scarlett's eyes, he knew she wouldn't believe it. He sighed quietly, then simply handed her the letter. She scanned it quickly, her eyes narrowing slightly as she read. When she looked back up, the thing he least expected happened. She didn't ask him if he had a plan. She didn't offer pity. Instead, she said one simple sentence. "So, what are we going to do to save it?" Christopher slammed the garage door shut, the echo reverberating through the empty space. The dim lights reflected off the cluttered table, covered with spare parts and scattered tools. Yet tonight, none of it felt comforting or familiar. 30%. A small figure on paper, but a storm in reality. He ran his hand over his face, smearing grease across his skin, but he didn't care. Losing this garage wasn't just about money. It meant losing the one stable thing he had left. For years, he'd been the one doing the fixing. Cars, engines, even the lives of people who drifted in and out of his workshop. But now, who was going to fix him? Ace approached slowly, resting his head on Christopher's knee, brown eyes reflecting his owner's quiet sorrow. Christopher gently scratched the dog's head. "We'll figure it out, buddy." Yet even as he said it, uncertainty filled his voice. Part of him wanted to handle everything alone, like he always had. He'd managed before, but this time it wasn't that simple. The garage door suddenly opened again. Christopher looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Scarlett stood in the doorway, not quite a stranger, but not yet someone fully familiar. Without waiting for an invitation, she walked in and placed a cup of coffee on the table. Her gaze met his, steady yet gentle. "Is something wrong?" she asked, folding her arms casually. Christopher hesitated before replying, "It's nothing you need to worry about." Scarlett smiled knowingly, though without humor. "I've met enough people to know that when someone says it's nothing, they usually mean, 'I'm drowning, but don't want anyone to see.'" He didn't respond immediately, glancing down at the crumpled notice still clutched in his hand. Scarlett took another step closer, lowering her voice softly. "Christopher, what's going on?" He exhaled, realizing he couldn't hide it from her any longer, and handed over the letter. Scarlett's eyes scanned it quickly, her expression turning serious. When she looked back up, he braced himself for pity or questions about his plans. But instead, she offered neither. She simply said quietly but firmly, "Then I guess we better figure out how we're going to save this place." Christopher felt a small smile creep onto his lips, the first genuine one in days. Maybe he didn't have to do this alone after all. Scarlett leaned back in her chair, her gaze calm yet razor-sharp as she regarded the man sitting across from her. The landlord of Martinez Auto Repair. He was a middle-aged man with a composed demeanor, but Scarlett had navigated enough negotiations to know one simple truth. Everyone had a weakness. "So you're saying the rent will increase by 30%? She asked, setting her coffee cup gently onto the table. The sound was subtle yet commanding. "An abrupt hike, especially when the town's economy isn't exactly booming?" The landlord cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. "It's a business decision. I've had other offers and I need to consider." Scarlett tilted her head slightly, cutting him off with a soft smile. "No, you don't." He froze. "You don't have anyone willing to pay that price," she continued, voice gentle but incisive. "If you did, the garage would already be rented out. Cedarvale is small, and businesses like Martinez Auto Repair are part of the community's fabric. If you push them out, you won't just lose a tenant, you'll lose your reputation." The landlord stared at her, clearly processing her words. Scarlett knew she'd hit the right nerve. She exhaled softly, leaning forward, her voice quieter but filled with unwavering confidence. "Here's my proposal. You keep the rent as is for 2 years. In exchange, I'll personally ensure Christopher improves his revenue. You keep a reliable tenant, the garage stays open, and everyone wins." The landlord nodded slowly, his earlier certainty fading. "You seem awfully confident." Scarlett smiled, eyes sparkling with assurance. "I don't make proposals unless I already know I've won." A few minutes later, the agreement was signed. As she stepped outside the cafe, Scarlett took a deep breath. Christopher didn't need to know about this, because this wasn't about his pride. It was about helping someone who didn't yet realize he deserved someone in his corner too. Christopher gripped the paper tightly in his hand, the words printed on it seeming to mock him. "The rent increase has been canceled. Previous terms remain unchanged." No explanation. No one claiming responsibility. But Christopher wasn't stupid. He knew exactly who was behind this. Anger rose in his chest, a bitter mixture of wounded pride and helplessness that he hated with every fiber of his being. Scarlett. She'd done this without saying a word, treating him as if he were someone who needed saving. The door to Martinez Auto Repair flew open, the bell ringing sharply from the sudden movement. Scarlett stepped inside, a faint smile appearing when she saw him, but it quickly vanished when she caught the look in his eyes, sensing the storm brewing within. "Is everything all right?" she asked cautiously. Christopher held up the paper. "Care to explain this?" Scarlett paused briefly, then sighed. She didn't look remotely apologetic. "So you found out?" Christopher clenched his jaw, his voice sharp as a knife. "What the hell did you think you were doing, Scarlett?" She crossed her arms defiantly. "I did what needed to be done." "No," he shot back, tossing the paper onto the table. "You did what you thought was best for me without ever bothering to ask. Do you think I'm incapable of handling my own problems?" Scarlett laughed softly, though there was no joy in it. "Really, Christopher? And what exactly was your plan? Quietly accepting losing the garage?" Christopher went rigid. She'd struck the nerve. The painful truth he didn't want to admit. He turned away, unable to look at her. Scarlett softened her voice, the sharpness fading away. "I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because I believe some things are worth fighting for. Martinez Auto Repair is one of them." Christopher closed his eyes for a moment. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. But beneath that anger was something else, a feeling he wasn't ready to name. A quiet question echoed in his mind. Had she done this for his garage or for him? Scarlett took a deep breath, holding Christopher's gaze, even though she could clearly feel the anger radiating from him. "Do you think I did this out of pity?" she asked, her voice calm yet sharp enough to cut through the tension. Christopher didn't respond immediately. The anger in his eyes wasn't simply about rent money. It was wounded pride, fear of losing control, of being placed in a position where decisions were taken out of his hands. Scarlett stepped closer, intentionally blocking any chance he might have had to turn away. "I didn't help you because I thought you couldn't handle it," she said slowly, firmly. "I did it because I knew you wouldn't do it for yourself. And it's not just about you." Christopher frowned slightly. Scarlett raised her hand, gesturing toward the open garage doors, toward the community outside, the townspeople who regularly stopped by, truck drivers trusting Christopher with their engines, families relying on him to keep their old cars running, friends who knew without words that Martinez Auto Repair wasn't just another garage. "This place isn't just yours," Scarlett continued, her voice softening yet still filled with conviction. "It belongs to the town. It's part of Cedarvale. From the first moment I met you, I saw someone who doesn't just fix cars. You fix other things too." Christopher swallowed hard, her words slicing through the defenses he'd carefully constructed. "How many people have you helped without expecting anything in return?" Scarlett pressed gently. "How many cars have you fixed for free because you knew the owners couldn't afford it?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, daring him to deny it. "And yet, when someone does the same for you, you push them away?" Christopher clenched his jaw, part of him wanting to resist, but another part knowing she was right. Scarlett's voice lowered even further. "I don't need your gratitude. I don't need you to owe me anything. But I'm not going to stand by and watch you lose this garage because you're too proud to accept help." Silence stretched between them. Finally, Christopher exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now, not resigned but finally accepting. "So, what do we do now?" Scarlett smiled, a small, victorious smile. Not because she had won the argument, but because she knew Christopher had finally taken the step he'd been resisting all along. Christopher crossed his arms, leaning back against the workbench, studying Scarlett carefully. She stood in the middle of the garage, eyes bright with excitement, as if she'd just stumbled upon an irresistible idea. "We should expand this place," and she said, not as a question, but as a firm statement. Christopher raised an eyebrow. "We?" Scarlett smiled softly, clearly anticipating his reaction. "You know I'm right. This garage has so much more potential. You've built a place people trust, but you're barely scratching the surface of what it could become. Christopher remained skeptical, arms still folded. And what exactly do you suggest? Turning this into a chain of repair shops all over town? Scarlett shook her head and stepped closer, her voice calm yet deeply convincing. Not a chain, but a true community service center. A place that doesn't just fix cars but helps people in need, offers job training to local youth, provides top-notch service while preserving the community spirit you've spent years creating. Christopher stayed silent. Her vision was far greater than anything he'd ever imagined. Scarlett continued gently. Have you ever noticed how many people come here not just to fix their vehicles, but to find a place where they belong? Truck drivers looking for a dependable stop. Families who need someone trustworthy to maintain their cars without fearing overpriced bills. Young people lacking direction who could learn skills directly from you. Christopher stared at her. She didn't just see an old garage. She saw a future. He glanced around the space, the faded walls, the worn tools, and all the memories this place held. Part of him wanted to dismiss the idea immediately, but another part couldn't deny she had a point. He sighed softly, finally uncrossing his arms. And how exactly do you propose we do this? Scarlett tilted her head slightly, a determined smile on her lips. By first believing that we can. Christopher stood in the center of the garage, his eyes moving slowly over each familiar detail. The oil-stained tools, the rusty pieces of metal, the board listing customer names he updated every day. Yet somehow, today, everything felt different. Not because the garage had changed, but because he had. How many years had he convinced himself he needed no one? How many times had he refused outstretched hands, believing that doing everything alone was the only way to survive? Ever since Margaret died, his life had shrunk down to these garage walls, broken cars and engines he could fix, because they were easier than human emotions. Machines didn't leave him. Machines didn't disappoint. But then Scarlett appeared. She'd shaken things up, seeing a future he'd never dared imagine. And the most frightening part wasn't that her ideas were too big. It was that he was beginning to believe she might be right. He sighed, leaning heavily against the workbench. What was he so afraid of? Afraid that if he accepted change, if he opened himself up again, he'd risk losing everything once more? He'd already lost Margaret. He'd already lost the dreams they'd shared. But that didn't mean he had to lose himself too. A gentle knock sounded on the door. Scarlett stood there, unhurried, unassuming, simply waiting. Christopher stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time in years, he spoke words he'd never admitted aloud before. I can't do this alone. Scarlett smiled, not with triumph, but with the quiet warmth of someone finally being trusted. Then don't. And right then, Christopher understood. It wasn't just about the garage anymore. It was about himself. Maybe finally, it was time to let someone in again. Christopher looked around the garage again, the place he'd spent most of his life, the place he'd believed could only exist one way. But now, thanks to Scarlett, he saw something different, a future he'd never dared imagine before. He sighed, his calloused hands intertwined thoughtfully. So, where do we start? Scarlett couldn't hide her triumphant smile, not because she'd won an argument, but because Christopher was finally ready to embrace change. And so they began. Building a new dream. On the first day, Christopher still felt skeptical. He was accustomed to doing things his way, simple, practical, without grand plans. But as Scarlett pointed to the blueprints, a vision began to take shape. Let's make this a place people come to, not just because they need their cars fixed, Scarlett said, touching the old weathered sign outside. Let's make it a place that truly serves this community. Christopher nodded slowly. Not just a repair shop, but a center that genuinely helped people. They hired extra hands, they cleaned up. The walls were repainted, worn-out tools replaced with newer, better equipment. But more importantly, they created a new kind of space. A place where local youth could learn new skills. A comfortable waiting area where people felt welcome to linger. And most importantly, they kept the core spirit of Martinez Auto Repair, a place where anyone could find help when they needed it. Renewed belief. One evening, as Christopher closed up after a long day, he paused to take in what they'd built. His garage, no, their garage, was now brightly lit, no longer worn down or weary. It was full of life, not only from fresh paint, but from the deeper sense of purpose it now held. Scarlett stepped quietly to his side, saying nothing, simply sharing the moment. Christopher glanced at her. She'd helped him see something he hadn't dared believe before, that the past didn't have to be the only thing defining a person, and sometimes the right hand reaching out at the right time could change everything. Christopher stood at the entrance to Martinez Auto Repair, arms folded as he took a deep breath, absorbing the morning sunlight washing over the newly transformed shop. The place that had once been just a quiet garage, dark, filled only with broken-down cars passing silently through, was now vibrant with life. No longer merely a repair shop, it had become a community hub, a place where people gathered not just to fix cars but to connect. The fresh scent of paint mixed with the aroma of coffee drifting from the new waiting area. Laughter mingled with the hum of engines, creating a symphony Christopher never imagined he'd hear. This wasn't just a garage anymore. It was now part of Cedarvale itself. People came in greater numbers than he'd ever expected. Some needed repairs, others simply wanted to celebrate the change. Old customers, familiar faces, and new ones, all sharing warm smiles. Pete Miller, a local farmer with rough, calloused hands, approached and gave Christopher a hearty pat on the shoulder. "I never thought you'd agree to change things up around here, but look at you now. You did it." Christopher smiled quietly, glancing towards Scarlett, who was busy chatting with a group of customers nearby. "Wasn't just me." Scarlett caught his eye from across the room, smiling knowingly as if she'd heard his thoughts. In another corner, local teenagers gathered around the newly established apprenticeship area, inspecting the neatly arranged, shiny new tools. A young boy, maybe 16, approached Christopher hesitantly, eyes shining with curiosity. "Can I really learn to fix cars here?" he asked shyly. Christopher bent down slightly, meeting the boy's gaze directly, then nodded firmly. "If you're willing to learn, then absolutely." The boy's face lit up with a wide smile. In that moment, Christopher realized the transformation wasn't only about himself, it was about the entire community. By midday, Martinez Auto Repair buzzed with activity like never before. And deep within Christopher, for the first time in years, he felt something other than the quiet ache of loneliness. He felt the warmth of a brand new beginning. Laughter, engine hums, and cheerful conversations filled Martinez Auto Repair on opening day. The people of Cedarvale had gathered in larger numbers than Christopher had ever imagined, coming together to celebrate the transformation of their beloved garage. But amid the bustling atmosphere, one four-legged creature raced happily around, bringing with him an energy that no one could resist. Ace. Ace, Christopher's loyal, short-haired pointer, had never been happier. He darted between chairs, weaving through the crowd, greeting everyone with an endlessly wagging tail. He wasn't just a dog, he was the heart and soul of this place. Children giggled as Ace circled around, barking joyfully as though fully aware of how special this day was. The youngest boy there, initially shy and hiding behind his mother, lit up with delight as Ace approached and gently rested his warm head on the boy's leg. Scarlett knelt down beside Ace, gently stroking his smooth fur. "I think he's enjoying today even more than we are," she said with a smile, glancing up at Christopher. Christopher folded his arms, watching his dog with a mix of pride and mild exasperation. He's always loved being the center of attention. No one could resist Ace's charm. Older customers sitting and chatting would pause occasionally to pat his head. A group of teenagers discussing the new training area laughed when Ace playfully joined their circle. Scarlett quietly observed. What she wanted to build here was more than just a garage. It was a place that brought people together. And Ace, in his own joyful way, was doing exactly that. A family formed. As the sun started to set, no one was eager to leave. This was no longer simply an old auto repair shop. It had become part of the town itself. Amidst it all, Ace finally settled beside Christopher, looking up at him with eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. Christopher bent down and gently rubbed Ace's head. "Well, buddy, seems like you've accomplished even more than I have today." Scarlett laughed softly. Maybe he's the true owner of Martinez Auto Repair. Christopher looked around the garage, a place transformed not just for himself, but for everyone here. And as Ace rested his head comfortably against Christopher's leg, breathing softly in the warmth of the evening, Christopher knew, deep down, that he had finally found his family again. Evening settled gently over Martinez Auto Repair, the warm glow from inside spilling out onto the sidewalk, illuminating the last remnants of an extraordinary day. Christopher stood quietly at the garage entrance, silently taking in the scene before him. A few townspeople still lingered, not ready to leave just yet. A group of teenagers sat in the new training area, enthusiastically discussing engines, parts, and things they'd never imagined understanding before. Across the yard, Ace rolled happily on the ground, eagerly accepting affection from a cluster of children gathered around him. Scarlett stepped beside Christopher, her hands tucked casually into her coat pockets, staying silent, as if sensing he needed this moment to absorb it all. For how many years had he focused solely on fixing broken things? Cars, engines, even himself. But today, for the first time in years, he wasn't just repairing, he was building something new. More than just a garage. Christopher glanced around, a strange feeling stirring inside him. For so long, he'd believed his work was just about changing oil, tightening bolts, and tuning engines. But now he saw hopeful faces, people who had found a place where they belonged. It wasn't just work anymore. It was a community. Scarlett spoke softly beside him, gently nudging him with her words. "Still think this place is just some old garage?" Christopher chuckled, a genuine laugh, one that surprised even himself. "No," he shook his head slowly, smiling. "It was never just a garage." Scarlett smiled warmly, recognizing that he'd finally understood what truly mattered. Life wasn't merely about repairing the things that were broken. It was about rebuilding and protecting the things worth keeping. And for the first time in a very long while, Christopher knew he was ready to begin again. The scent of fresh paint mingled with engine grease, and the faint aroma of freshly baked pies from the cafe across the street. The grand opening had ended, and as the crowd dispersed, a peaceful stillness settled over the garage, leaving just Christopher, Scarlett, and Ace curled comfortably at their feet. They stood quietly side by side, savoring the calm after a day filled with excitement. Christopher glanced at Scarlett, noticing the way she gazed thoughtfully into the distance. Something about her seemed different, softer, more at ease than the guarded woman he'd first met. "How long do you plan on staying in town?" he asked gently, breaking the comfortable silence. Scarlett smiled lightly, her eyes still fixed somewhere far away. "I haven't decided yet." Christopher nodded slowly, understanding. She'd learned to slow down here, something neither of them had expected. He raised his cup, taking a quiet sip before adding softly, "We've come a long way." Scarlett met his eyes. "We really have. Farther than I think either of us imagined." He nodded, a quiet acknowledgement. "I suppose we have." Neither of them felt the need to say more. No promises, no expectations. But they both knew. They knew they had found each other at exactly the right moment. And sometimes that was enough. The sun set gently over Martinez Auto Repair, painting the sky in a warm, burnt orange glow. The garage stood proudly, not the quiet, worn-out place it once was, but now an essential part of the town, filled with meaning, warmth, and people who had rediscovered themselves here. Christopher and Scarlett stood side by side in front of the freshly painted garage doors, the new sign glinting softly under the streetlights. Yet what stood out most wasn't the fresh paint or upgraded equipment. It was the unmistakable feeling of a genuine new beginning. Christopher slipped his hands into his jacket pockets, glancing over at Scarlett. "Never imagined I'd end up here." She smiled softly, eyes never leaving the garage. "Me neither." A gentle breeze drifted by, carrying with it the familiar scent of engine oil mixed with the faint aroma of wood and the coolness of approaching night. Ace lay comfortably on the steps nearby, lazily wagging his tail in time with his steady breathing. Scarlett turned toward Christopher, her eyes reflecting something deeper, More than just satisfaction from helping someone, but a genuine connection. "What do you think about the future?" she asked softly, her voice barely louder than the evening breeze. Christopher was silent for a moment, looking down at his hands. Hands that had only known fixing broken machines. Hands he'd believed existed only to repair what was damaged. But now he knew he was building something new. Not just a garage, but a life worth living. Finally, he nodded gently. "I think we're going to be okay." Scarlett laughed softly, tilting her head playfully. "Just okay?" Christopher smiled warmly, the kind of smile he rarely showed before. "Better than okay." And so they stood quietly side by side, not rushing, not needing any more words. Just two people who'd found each other at exactly the right moment, gazing forward toward a future that was only just beginning. It's never too late. Maybe you've believed that opportunities only come around once. Maybe you've convinced yourself the past is something you can't change. That once you've lost something important, once you've been hurt, once you've let too much time pass, it's too late to turn back. But what if you're wrong? What if you still have a chance? Christopher never went looking for change. He thought it was too late to start over. Then Scarlett walked in, quiet yet fierce, a gentle storm that pulled him out of the comfort zone he'd built around himself for years. Nothing came easily. There was struggle, pain, and invisible walls he had to tear down. But together they learned the most important lesson of all. Your past doesn't have to define your future. It's never too late. Some things in life can't be fixed, but they can be rebuilt. Some losses may never fully heal, but that doesn't mean you stop living. Christopher and Scarlett didn't have a perfect plan. They didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but they knew they no longer had to face it alone. And sometimes that's enough to begin again. What do you think? Do you believe in second chances? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if this story spoke to you, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more meaningful stories just like this waiting for you. Who knows? Maybe someday, your own second chance will arrive. Valuable lessons from their story. Life is a journey, and sometimes we get stuck walking the same familiar path, believing it's the only road available. But is it really? Christopher and Scarlett's story isn't just about finding each other. It's about rediscovering themselves, even when they believed every door had closed. Christopher was trapped in his past, convinced work was his only escape from loss. Scarlett ran from her pain, hiding behind a mask of success. But together they learned that life can offer a second chance, even when you least expect it. Lesson 1. It's never too late to start over. Your past doesn't have to define your future. You can stand up, begin again, and build something new at any moment. Lesson 2. You don't have to face everything alone. Christopher learned that accepting help doesn't make him weak. It makes him stronger. Scarlett realized she could trust again. Sometimes having someone by your side makes all the difference. Lesson 3. Happiness isn't found in grand achievements. It's hidden in simple moments. An honest conversation, a heartfelt dinner, or a reassuring pat on the shoulder. These simple moments often hold the deepest happiness. What about you? Have you experienced moments like this in your life? Have you found strength in unexpected places, or felt a second chance waiting just around the corner? If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Because sometimes it's the smallest moments that change us the most.